Well, following the release of the Section 89 independent panel report on the Phala Phala saga, the Democratic Alliance says it plans to table a motion to dissolve Parliament to enable an early election. The opposition says South Africans should not be left with limited options on their choice of leaders. Now, this would be an unprecedented move to attempt to dissolve Parliament and begs the question, is it even feasible? Executive Chairperson at the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa, Tselane, joins me for a conversation on this. And Tselane, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us this morning. That is the question this morning. I mean, is an early election even something that's feasible at this point?
Good morning to you, Ndogos, and to your viewers. Of course, the Constitution does provide for a possibility of an early election. In particular, Section 50 provides that in the event that Parliament is dissolved by two-thirds majority, then an early election must be held. And alternatively, if the National Assembly is not able to elect a president within 30 days after the dissolution of Parliament, then an early election must be held. However, there are practical reasons why it would not be feasible to have an early election. As you may be aware that in order to have an election, you need to have a legislative framework. Currently, the legislative framework that provides for an election is the Electoral Act, and that Electoral Act was declared invalid and unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court sometime last year. The reason why it was declared invalid was because it did not provide for other citizens to participate in an election as independent candidates or to participate in elections through a process other than through participation through a political party. Now, because that has been declared invalid, Parliament has been seized with the issue of having to develop a new framework. That bill has not been finalized. So it means it is not possible, therefore, to have an early election because there is no framework within which the election can actually be held.
That is an important point, but in a hypothetical scenario, Dr. Tselane, where our legislative framework is in place and is constitutionally viable, we know the constraints within which the Independent Electoral Commission often has to work in when putting together an election, and one that is free and fair. We know that there is a 24-month requirement. Now, in 2021, that was tested because of COVID-19 and the ramifications of those lockdowns, forcing the IEC to conduct local government elections within the space of 18 months. Is that something that could still be applied in this instance, in a hypothetical scenario where the framework is in existence?
Well, in that event, the Electoral Commission must be able to have an election within 90 days. So what the Constitution says is that once Parliament has been dissolved, the election must be held within 90 days. So the IEC in that event has got to be ready to deliver the elections within 90 days. But as I've indicated, that assumes that the legislation is in place. And if the legislation is not in place like we have now, it is not going to be practical for the IEC to have an election and then to be ready within 90 days.
The entire inception of this conversation really has to do with the Phala Phala farm saga and the Section 89 panel's report, and of course the Democratic Alliance responding to the contents of that report. Everything about this context is unprecedented. It's an extraordinary time that South Africans find themselves in. Would an approach to the Constitutional Court in any way throw some sort of a span in the works or some sort of gauntlet in the works and enable the DA to conduct this process, or at least make that application for the process to go forward?
No. Of course, they are within their rights to approach the Constitutional Court. However, what the Constitution also requires is that before an election is declared, the President or the acting President must consult the Electoral Commission. Section 17 of the Electoral Act basically provides for a situation where the person calling for the election, either being the president or the acting president, must consult the Electoral Commission first and only announce the date of the elections or the voting day after having consulted with the Electoral Commission. Now, in the event where the Electoral Commission is not able to practically have an election, because firstly they're going to say there is no national framework within which we are going to have the elections, we've got to firstly have that national framework, and then once we've got the act, we've got to put in place systems for the implementation or operationalizing that legal framework. And then from there, the IEC still has to recruit and train its staff in order to be able to deliver the election. And it is therefore not practical. And the Electoral Commission is going to be saying to the president or the acting president that it is not going to be feasible to have the elections within 90 days, particularly because of those practical factors that I have mentioned. So I don't think that even if the Democratic Alliance went to Constitutional Court, the Constitutional Court would basically agree to have an election in spite of the fact that there is no national framework, rather there is no legal framework that will determine the framework within which those elections will be taking place.
Right. Talking about that legislative framework, and Dr. Tselane, we know that the deadline for Parliament to conclude its amendments to the Electoral Act, the deadline was for the 10th of December. That date is fast approaching, but we also know that there are plans to approach the Court for a further extension. How is that likely to affect those general elections that are slated for 2024?
Well, the time frames that the Electoral Commission is supposed to use to hold free and fair elections have already been compromised by the delay in finalizing the national framework for the elections. Now, if this is delayed further, it means it might actually affect the capacity of the Commission to have the elections within a constitutionally stipulated period.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Terry Tselane, for joining us on the program and helping us to have that conversation. That was Executive Chairperson at the Institute for Election Management Services in Africa, Terry Tselane, just helping us to unpack that question, whether or not an early election is even something that is practically feasible at this point.